So with Twisting Blades being nerfed in terms of being able to cycle your cooldowns a lot quicker, I was on the lookout for a new build and I have been absolutely loving Penetrating Shot. So I want to show you the build I've been running. It does not require any legendary aspects with the addition of the realistic drop rates in the server slam. It is incredibly difficult to get any sort of legendary aspects. I have played the rogue now for about 7 hours and I have gotten a single legendary, so I am not going to include any legendary aspects besides the ones that are in the Codex of Power that you can get guaranteed. Let's dive into it. So let's go over the skills here. We have 21 points, which includes the 2 renown points. You're going to have to pick those up if you wish to go ahead and finish this build. First off, we have the basic skill, which is going to be Puncture. Now, Puncture is actually a ranged skill, which is really useful. And the main reason we're picking it up is for the fundamental Puncture here. This is going to give us permanent vulnerable uptime, which gives us 20% increased damage. What Puncture does is essentially you're going to have 3 blades that shoot out, as you can see here. And if you hit with 2 of them, you're going to get permanent vulnerability or apply vulnerability for 2 seconds, which if you weave it in between your penetrating shots is permanent vulnerable uptime. Now, before we get that 3rd point though, we're going to put 2 points into Puncture, come down and pick up Penetrating Shot, and then go back up for Fundamental Puncture. And then Penetrating Shot is the namesake of this build. This does really solid single target damage, but also has the potential for AoE damage due to it piercing. In my opinion, there is realistically 3 skills that I've really enjoyed on the rogue: Twisting Blades, Barrage, or not Barrage, Rapid Fire actually, and Penetrating Shot. Those are the 3 that I like. And Penetrating Shot has a good mix of AoE and single target damage, whereas Rapid Fire is pure single target. And then the unfortunate thing about Twisting Blades is that it's melee. Penetrating Shot is a good mix, very solid damage. And what's really nice about it is if you come down here and you're consistently landing multiple penetrating shots, you can actually start critting quite a bit of times when you're in those groups of enemies. After you've picked up and put some points in a penetrating shot, you're going to unlock the agility skills, and you're going to want to pick up Shadow Step and Dash. This is going to allow us to move really quickly around dungeons and just around the map. And actually, crucially, Shadow Step makes you unstoppable. So this is actually a CC break on potentially boss fights. So you actually don't want to use this during boss fights or maybe a tricky elite scenario if you think you're going to get CC'd, because this is going to break that CC, which is huge. Every build, in my opinion, should have multiple, if you can, or at least one form of CC break, because that's one of the only ways you actually die in this game. After you've picked up both of those, then you come back up and max out Penetrating Shot. After you've maxed out Penetrating Shot, then you can come down here and pick up Concealment. Now, Concealment actually got a buff, and on top of that, it also makes you unstoppable. So you have 2 CC breaks with this build, which is really nice in terms of survivability. Not only that, we're picking up Concealment because we're going to gain energy when we enter it, and more importantly, when we break that concealment, we get a guaranteed crit, which is a really nice thing with our Penetrating Shot. We can go ahead, cast a couple, enter concealment, gain that energy back, and then launch a crit strike 1, which is huge. Lastly, we pick up 1 point of Shadow Imbuement. This is really nice to help out with some AoE scenarios, and I run Shadow Imbuement typically unless I'm going to fight a boss, and if I'm fighting a boss, I'm going to pick up Poison Imbuement. Why? Because we're going to do more damage single target than Shadow Imbuement. Pretty simple, but both are very good for those select scenarios. And if you wish to, once again, changing 1 point is very simple, and it's going to help you out quite a bit during boss fights. After we've picked up Shadow Imbuement, then we come back up and pick up a few traits. I picked up Weapon Mastery because I would much prefer to use a bow. Okay, bows are just going to give us 12% increased damage because we're going to have that permanent vulnerable uptime, and that's going to be huge in general for our build. Not only that, but I also pick up 2 points into Exploit. Now, the reason why I don't necessarily go for maxing out Exploit versus the increased damage on vulnerable targets is because during boss fights, you're actually gonna get a little bit more value out of just the constant damage increase from your bow. Again, only if you have a bow. The crossbows seem to not do quite as much. Versus this, which is only applicable to people on above 80% or below 35%. But what this does is it basically gives us 12% damage increase for any of the normal trash that you're clearing, which basically allows you to potentially one-shot them if it's a specific type of normal monster, which is really, really nice. And of course, it will help you against boss fights, and I'm always looking for that pretty solid damage increase. You could instead just go 1.1 points into the vulnerable Malice here, which is just going to give you extra permanent damage, but actually Exploit tends to be a little bit more useful than Malice in my opinion. So that's going to be the skills here. You could go a little bit more defensive. You know, you could run potentially some extra movement speed options. You could run Sturdy. You can run Siphoning Strike. You know, all of these different things. Obviously, this one's not super, super great because you're not going to be close to the enemies. But you could run all sorts of different options in terms of traits or potentially, you know, some different abilities. Smoke Grenade is actually a really, really nice one specifically for these two points. Enhanced Smoke Grenade and Subverting Smoke Grenade, because you're going to be able to apply vulnerable all the time, and 15% increased damage is quite nice. So I like those two. I also like Poison Trap. If you're able to keep them in the area, it actually does really, really solid damage. There's a ton of options, and Dark Shroud is actually really, really nice and will help you reduce damage quite a bit. So a lot of options. What I wouldn't change is Shadow Step, Dash, Penetrating Shot, and Puncture. After that, you can change Concealment, you can change Shadow Imbuement. Those ones aren't as important, but I would recommend going with only one Subterfuge skill if you're going to go ahead and replace Concealment, and then I would go with an Imbuement because the Imbuments are incredibly, incredibly good. So that's going to be the skills. Let's dive into the other parts of this build. A couple things with gear that you might want to pay attention to. First off, we're not really going to be talking about legendaries because in the Codex of Power, you don't really have anything that can truly benefit in terms of damage of this build. If you're looking for legendary aspects that you might want to search for, extra damage based on primary resource is always nice, and any damage increasing of core skills or any penetrating shot aspect that you can acquire at all is going to be good, but it's going to be extremely rare to find what you're looking for. So hopefully you get lucky, right? But that's not really what I wanted to mention. First off, we have extra ranks of Penetrating Shot is going to be super massive. Similar to these gloves here, instead of Rapid Fire, you're going to want Penetrating Shot. You have to run a bow for the weapon mastery to be as effective as possible. So I really recommend you run a bow. And then we're going to be looking for critical strike damage and critical strike chance whenever we can get it. Specifically damage because we have guaranteed crit on the concealment and we have extra crit chance on our penetrating shot. And we also want to run an emerald because it's going to give us extra crit strike damage against vulnerable enemies. So this is basically like a 6% crit damage increase that we will get very, very often, if not permanently, because we will permanently keep uptime on our vulnerable, hopefully. Now, one other thing about this build before we dive into the showcase, and that is specializations. Now, first off, we have combo points. Now, what combo points does is it's going to raise our damage by a pretty massive margin. You can see at 0 combo points, we have 356 damage, and at 3 combo points, we have 677 damage. Pretty massive, honestly, and is worth considering when you're clearing dungeons. However, Inner Sight tends to be a little bit better when you're fighting bosses. And the reason for this is when you're fighting bosses, the mark will automatically apply to anyone around you, and usually it's just the boss. So if that's the case, then you're going to be hitting the boss and you're going to be guaranteed getting the Inner Sight. And then when it procs, you can spam out those penetrating shots like crazy and just absolutely blast the boss. But combo points, if you have a boss that potentially has a couple of ads, or if you're just generally clearing content, combo points is really, really good and will give you a lot of value as well. As you can see, almost a 2 times damage multiplier for 3 points. And if you do run combo points, just make sure you're basicing 3 times in between your penetrating shots, unless you have so much energy that you cannot use it all. Then you can potentially cast multiple penetrating shots. So really quickly, just to show you all how this build kind of works, we're going to be wanting to dash around, right, when we're moving around the map. Here's an event here that I'm just going to do. And you'll notice while I'm attacking these enemies, we're going to want to hit with our basic first because we're going to apply that vulnerable. And if you have a bunch of ads here that are pretty tiny, you can just kill them all with one single penetrating shot, kind of like this. So when you're moving around, try to group up the enemies in a line, and that'll allow you to hit everyone with your penetrating shot. On top of that, when you get the chance, if you have a bunch of groups like this, you can drop that Shadow Imbuement and then basically nuke everyone down very, very quickly. I would recommend saving your Shadow Step typically for just any sort of scenario that might be a little scary, right? But if you're in an open world scenario like this, you probably won't have one, so you can just proc it whenever you wish. And if you have an elite enemy, make sure that you hit them with a basic, make sure you proc that vulnerable, enter concealment, and then you can nuke someone down with that massive crit, as you saw there. It does very, very good damage when considering a pretty large group of enemies. You can just nuke them all down with a single crit. Pretty massive there. You can see with the crits, we can do upwards of like 1200 damage, which although is not insanely high, we don't have legendaries, right? We don't have the level 25 that we were seeing before. It still does really, really solid damage. Now, in a situation like this, again, we're gonna wanna pop our shadow imbuement to nuke down all the enemies. And then we're gonna proc the vulnerable, right? Hit the vulnerable, hit the vulnerable. Make sure combo points are up, right? We want to shoot penetrating shot every single time. That we have 3 combo points. You can see there it did 581 damage. If we don't, well, we got a lucky hit there. It does about 251 damage. You can see there. Let's do that again. Boom, 264 damage. So not really quite amazing. So the goal is apply vulnerable, right? Get those combo points up, enter concealment, and smack. 1500 damage on a crit there. Pretty massive. And if you cycle through that, obviously you're not gonna have concealment every time, but if you do, it's gonna do massive, massive damage for you, okay? So hopefully that gives you a good idea on how this build functions, as well as the potential you can have for it. None of the builds really right now are going to be that great because, again, it's so rare to acquire legendary aspects that unless you have some sort of class that benefits or some sort of build that benefits immediately from an aspect in this specific map, well, you're kind of out of luck and you just got to work with the rares around you. But this penetrating shot build has been really, really good for me. And what's really nice about it is that it is ranged, which the Twisting Blades rogue was not. So you didn't get nearly as much value in some of the more melee rough fights because of, again, things like snares, things like poison fields that you can't hit the boss with. And so having a ranged build always feels really, really nice, and penetrating shot has really not disappointed. One other thing that I want to mention, again, just so for those of you that don't quite understand the specialization system, which can be kind of tricky sometimes, I will activate it here just to show you what that looks like. Before we end the video, if we were going to walk around and we find a group of enemies, what it will do is it will mark a specific target. Come on, give us a target. So you can see there, it's got a little purple marker above its head. You want to hit that target and it will fill up this gauge in the bottom right. You can see there, when I hit that target, I gain a little like yellow bar progress. So we're going to go ahead and keep hitting those targets. It's going to randomly select a target, which is why I say when you fight bosses, you want to have the inner sight can be potentially amazing due to all the energy regeneration. And then as soon as we get that, it's going to proc the purple and you're going to get unlimited energy for that time being. So you can just spam out those piercing shots, which is super, super nice. Combo points, generally speaking, are going to be better in most content, but inner sight can be valuable in some single target scenarios. Hopefully that helps. Thanks for watching. See you tomorrow.